Listeners, beware. This podcast contains themes of the macabre and does not shy away from the details. Our content is graphic and our language is colorful. We might not be your cup of tea, so listener discretion is strongly advised. Two best friends with a proclivity to decipher the deeply demented minds of murderers.
Welcome to Season 2, Episode 8 of The Killer Tea. Today we'll be discussing the Werewolf of Wysteria, Albert Fish.
We are your hosts, Christina
and Chelsea.
Well, you know how we always say that we're the purveyors of bullshit?
This is some bullshit.
I think we have found the winner.
The winner of the bullshit.
Because this guy is so bad, he's probably the worst serial killer I think we've covered to date.
He is 100% the worst serial killer.
We're going to go ahead and do a trigger warning because this deals with child murders. So, trigger warning. If pedophilia is a hard no for you, and rape and murder and
cannibalism,
dismemberment,
this is not your episode. Skip it. We'll see you next time.
And we totally understand because same.
Same. We have avoided doing this guy, even though he's been requested by many of you.
We're moms, man. It's just hard to talk about this sort of stuff.
It's really hard to talk about this.
However, it's time. We're going to tackle it. So, Chelsea, why don't you set the mood again? We've recorded 3 times by now, just so you know. We keep fucking it up, but this is the real time this time. So, Chelsea, set the mood.
Again. Albert Fish was born Hamilton Howard Fish on May 19th, 1870 in Washington, D.C. to Randall and Ellen Fish. He was the youngest child and had 3 living siblings, Walter, Annie, and Edwin. Interesting fact, his father was 75 years old at the time of his birth and was 43 years older than his mother.
Fish's father, Randall, was a riverboat captain, and eventually he would become a fertilizer manufacturer. And as we will really touch on here later, mental illness ran abundantly throughout both his maternal and paternal sides of his family. We're talking aunts, brothers, sisters, mother.
His family wasn't touched with mental illness. They were full-blown drowning in it.
So his brother was in an asylum. His uncle was diagnosed with religious mania. His mother experienced regular hallucinations. His half-brother died in a state hospital. His younger brother was described as feeble-minded, and he died of hydrocephalus, which is the buildup of fluid in the cavities deep within the brain. The excess fluid increases the size of the ventricles and puts pressure on the brain. All of that to say he had excess fluid in the brain, which ultimately led to his death, and I felt was worth mentioning because now we also have some physical abnormalities that run in their family. So,
I mean, I don't know if hydrocephaly is necessarily considered genetic. I don't think it is. Don't quote me on that, but I don't think it's considered genetic. I think it's just an anomaly. But that is a very interesting disorder and
hey, who knows?
Worth mentioning.
So his mother was described as being a very unusual. She had some of her own mental illnesses.
Yeah, she was described as having both visual and auditory hallucinations.
And then his aunt was also called completely crazy. His brother suffered from chronic alcoholism, and his sister was described as having some sort of mental affliction. But, you know, we're talking in the 1800s, so who knows
Nothing
exactly
concrete.
what that meant.
Could have been schizophrenia, could have been bipolar disorder. I mean, there's so many things.
I would definitely wager on schizophrenia running in this family.
It's possible.
It's possible. So after the death of his father, obviously his father is the breadwinner. We're talking 6 children. How many children were there?
There were 5 children before that were living.
Okay. His father passes away. His mother has mental illness. She's not able to provide for her family. So she then has to send the children to an orphanage, and the boys go to an all-boys orphanage for 4 years.
Yes, they were put into the St. John's Orphanage, which was in Washington.
The caretakers, and I use that term very lightly, aka the nuns. The sisters.
Let's be real here. Catholics, come get your people.
They would partake in vigorously beating the children there, the boys, and also sometimes encouraging other boys to beat on each other. So
he's 5.
Very young.
He's 5.
Growing up and witnessing this in very formative years of his life. And when he turned 6 years old, he describes a sexual awakening of sorts when he realizes that he is
becoming aroused during these beatings
by seeing other boys in pain and also receiving pain as well.
Yes.
Again, he is 6 years old.
He actually describes one of these encounters as saying that his sexual awakening happened when the nun at the orphanage made several boys undress and then would take turns beating the boys while the others watched.
If she was going to be beating a boy, she would force the next boy to watch.
Yes.
And I, in the research, found 2 different explanations of this scenario where either A, Albert watched and had a physical reaction to it and then was harassed endlessly by other children. But another retelling of it was that he just realized that he was sexually attracted to that. I'm inclined to believe the first.
Yeah. Well, while at the orphanage, this is when he began going by Albert. Because his name was Hamilton, the boys would often make fun of him and call him Ham and Eggs.
Kids are assholes.
Fucking terrible. And so he started going by Albert, which was his deceased sibling's name, which is
odd.
Weird.
So when asked about the orphanage, Fish would later remark that I was there till nearly 9, and that's where I got started wrong. We were unmercifully whipped. I saw boys doing many things they should not have done. Interesting.
In 1880, his mother Ellen began working a government job. This makes her a lot more stable on the financial side, and she regained custody of Albert. You would think that this would be a good thing. He's back with his mother. He should be getting back into a normal childhood. That's not what happens.
That's not what happens. He began experimenting with his own sadomasochistic tendencies.
He's 9.
But he's still experimenting with hurting himself for sexual gratification.
Yes. And it gets worse.
He begins with sexual mutilation, where he's embedding needles into his groin and his penis, and sometimes even flogging himself. I mean, here's something that we didn't touch on before. Where did the idea for the needles come from at such a young age? I can't help but wonder if something happened other than just the beatings while he was at the orphanage.
Who knows? Who honestly knows? We know these orphanages ran by nuns
weren't always the best. We have covered serial
We
killers
have
in the
covered
past.
serial killers where they have experienced beatings at the hands of nuns in the past.
That were excessive and not merciful. I mean, not to paint them all with the same brush.
This is not a uncommon occurrence.
To be fair,
the
the source of this information about his past does come from Albert himself in a retelling of what he would explain to the psychiatrist that would later examine him, what he would give interviews to. This is not really by anybody else's account.
With that being said, I don't see Albert having any reason to embellish on his history. I mean, we don't know a lot about his intellect, but he doesn't seem to be that cunning.
Yeah.
I mean, when asked about his wrongdoings, he's very forthcoming about what he did.
And he is still religious. He maintains being religious throughout his life.
We'll get into it later, but it's speculated that his reasoning for doing some of the things that he did came from a religious mania.
Yeah, which is something that
we'll talk about.
So in 1882, at 12 years old, his relationship with a telegraph boy develops into somewhat sexual. He's introduced by this boy into eating human feces and drinking human urine, and actually gets sexual gratification from doing those things. Chelsea had really technical terms for them. I don't. It's so gross.
If you're curious on what these scientific terms are, drinking urine is called urolagnia, and eating feces is called coprophagia.
Now, these two boys began visiting public baths where they would watch other boys undress. So this is their voyeurism.
This is their weekend activities.
And this continued on till essentially he up and moved with his mom in 1890 into New York.
Once they're there, he begins working as a prostitute to make money.
Allegedly.
And to me, though, this makes sense.
I agree, it makes sense. There was just no way to confirm that information.
No, he had very little education, almost none, and working in a physical sense was more along the lines of what he was taught as a child. Mm-hmm. So to me, him becoming a prostitute, we know he's a homosexual, or at least interested in relationships with men. Mm-hmm. But during this time is when his pedophilia really starts.
We don't have like an exact date of when his very first crime was ever committed. It's kind of alluded to that there was a first victim that he recounts, but there's also a lot of
gray area.
Basically, by the time that we have an actual victim that we can put a name to with evidence, he seems almost experienced.
He's been doing this for a while.
I would question, was this going on during his teenage years? Had it escalated throughout that time? I don't believe the victims that we're going to start talking about are his first.
No, absolutely not. During this time that he is allegedly working as a prostitute, he would often lure young boys out of their homes and molest them. He would often beat them with a paddle that he had made out of wood and had nails sticking out of it. This is where his raping of young boys really begins.
Albert strategically picks neighborhoods that are poor, minority neighborhoods, children who are mentally impaired. He's specifically targeting victims that he believes are not going to put up much of a fight and that police are not going to really pay attention to should they go missing. This is a very conscious decision that he makes, but regardless, he's still opportunistic. He's choosing them based on whatever opportunities arise throughout his day.
Right. He's picking children that are outside in front of their homes, that may be at a park or are on a farm. He is being very opportunistic.
And he's luring them away with promises of treats and of money. And especially money was a very promising thing because when you're in a poor neighborhood, I mean, that's a really big deal.
It is.
And he, at the time, is working now as a painter and a wallpaper hanger. So he's essentially able to survey and canvass these areas that he's getting jobs to. It's rumored that he actually would use the basements of a lot of the homes that he was working at as his like home base,
right,
for molesting children.
Right, to commit these crimes. In 1898, His mother arranges a marriage for him. Now, there's some dispute on if she just introduced them or if she actually arranged the marriage.
By this time, at 28 years old, most men are married. So.
Yeah. He ends up marrying Anna Mary Hoffman, who was 19 at the time, which makes her 9 years younger. They end up being together for quite a long time and have 6 children: Albert, Anna, Gertrude, Eugene, John, and Henry.
He is still having adulterous affairs with men.
Yes.
He has full-fledged lovers.
Yes, he
not
does.
Just like one-night stands. He has people that he sees habitually.
Well, one of these lovers introduced him to, well, not on purpose, but introduced him into sexual mutilation.
Yeah, he's leveling up now on his grossness level.
Yes. This particular lover takes him to a waxworks museum where there is a display of a bisection of a penis. Albert kind of obsesses over this. This is where the sexual mutilation really starts coming into play. Now, throughout this time, not only is he having male lovers, he's still molesting children, young boys specifically, and he is married to his wife.
So we don't have a reason, an outright, clear-cut reason as to why his wife eventually left him.
No.
However, we can surmise that she may have caught on to these adulterous affairs, if not caught him in the act. Because when she left, she took everything, sold it all, and left him with 6 children.
Right.
So to me, that is...
I mean, there are some other things during their marriage. Like in 1903, he was arrested for grand larceny and was convicted and incarcerated. So that was, 14 years
very
before she left, but still problematic.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1910, he starts up a relationship with a 19-year-old man named Thomas Kedden.
But again, I don't think she knows about this stuff.
No, I don't think she does either.
In 1910, he gets a job working with this 19-year-old kid, hanging wallpaper, painting. When I say he gets a job, they get a job together. At this point in time, he had started getting really curious about what it would be like to inflict murderous sadomasochistic pain on somebody else, like taking it to the next level. And 10 days into their knowing each other, they allegedly decided to have consensual sadomasochistic sex. Allegedly. Now, the retelling that I have heard was that it started off consensual and then it becomes very ambiguous as to how far that consent went later on into the relationship. This relationship was very, very short-lived.
Yes.
Because homeboy decides to tell Kedden that they have a job at this farmhouse. He lures him there, locks him inside, and then decides to torture him for 2 weeks.
And by torture... So he's torturing him sexually. At the escalation of this, ends up tying him up and cutting off half of his penis.
He admitted later that he fully intended to completely dismember Kedden.
Yes.
However, in the actual physical act of doing it, like he had the blade, was cutting him, it was happening, he saw the look of terror and pain and anguish in Kedden's face and had instant guilt and remorse, immediately stopped, bandaged him up as best as he could, kissed him,
left him a $10 bill
for his troubles,
and vanished.
And then fucked off, but never bothered to check back to find out any way whatsoever he could if Kedden survived the ordeal. And he very well may not have.
No, he cut off half his penis.
He could have bled the fuck out and died. Who knows? I had to mention that because he cared enough to stop.
Right.
But not enough to make sure that he
him.
Survived.
That takes us to January 1917, which is when his wife fucks off.
His wife leaves him for a family friend.
It was a man that the family knew really well. I believe they had kind of had a working relationship at some point.
Okay.
And she runs off with him, leaving Albert with their 6 children and literally nothing. She takes almost every single possession they own and sells it and leaves.
So that tells me that she needed the money in order to go, and then leaving the children behind. It sounds like almost like an act of desperation, but I don't believe she knew what Albert was doing crime-wise.
No, I don't think so. I mean, maybe she believed that he was homosexual and wanted to leave for that reason. Maybe their marriage just wasn't that great.
I know it became a sore point for him forever. If you don't consider his behavior before this spiraling, this is definitely a spiral period for him moving forward.
After she leaves, he begins having auditory hallucinations, saying that he was following instructions of John the Apostle by wrapping himself in a carpet.
I believe it was his eldest son and maybe his youngest son were telling a story to reporters about how they remembered seeing their dad up on a hill with his arms spread out, like standing at a cross saying, "I am Christ."
I mean, his uncle was institutionalized for religious mania.
Despite dealings with the Catholic Church and the nuns, he maintained being a religious person. Albert is now a single parent. He has to raise 6 children. Allegedly, he never abused any of them. So we have that going for him.
Well, I wouldn't say
he never physically assaulted
them
in a sexual manner.
He did subject them to his sadomasochistic games, if you would call them that. He would often encourage his children and sometimes even their friends to paddle him with a nail-filled paddle until he was bleeding. I mean, that's fucking traumatizing. That's fucking weird.
By 1919, he had developed a obsession with torture, which we know.
We know. And with sexual mutilation,
which
we know.
And now we are entering the territory of cannibalism. I had never realized that serial killers who commit acts of cannibalism start usually with eating raw meat. It never even occurred to me. So how he started introducing himself to cannibalism was by eating and serving his children raw meat. So he was subjecting them to that as well. Do we know what sets him off for cannibalism? I don't remember finding anything.
Honestly, I think it's just an escalation at this point for him. Mm-hmm. Obviously, he is mentally unwell.
The torture is not enough. The mutilation is not enough. He is wanting to commit murder now. He tried, got really guilty, and got cold feet.
Yes.
So I can't help but wonder if maybe the thoughts of cannibalism were, how am I going to dispose of a body when I do actually kill it? Oh, I can eat it.
Actually, I think we even get into why the cannibalism later on when we start talking about the religious part of it.
It's very well possible that religion could have first introduced him to cannibalism, because I know there's some stuff in the Bible. It's a punishment for like when the Israelites didn't obey the word of God and they were like the worst ones for not listening to him. It's a quote in Jeremiah, and I can't remember it for the life of me, but it more or less says like, you are going to eat the flesh of your brothers and your sisters. And then there's another one about eating the flesh of children, but I can't remember that one. That one is in like Leviticus. I can't remember it. But yes, cannibalism is in the Bible, and he very well may have heard it from there, which first could have introduced him to it. Regardless, I don't know what the setting off point was after all this other escalation that he had that made him go, hey,
this seems like a good idea.
This seems like a great idea.
He is now paying boys to procure him other children, and he would torture, mutilate, and often murder these children with what he called his implements of hell, which were a meat cleaver, a butcher knife, and a small handsaw. This is going to take us to his first crime that we really kind of know the details on, which happens on July 11th, 1924. Albert found an 8-year-old girl, Beatrice Keel. She was playing alone on her parents' farm in Staten Island, New York. Albert tried to persuade her to leave with him by offering her money to come and help him look for rhubarb. She was about to go with him when her mother realized what was happening and chased Albert away. But Albert did end up coming back to the farm later that evening and tried to sleep in their barn. But Beatrice's father caught him and forced him to leave.
He doesn't just go after boys. Obviously, we're talking about a girl right now. But he does treat the boy victims differently than he treats the girl victims.
100%. He has no qualms about molesting or raping boys, but doesn't have any sexual motivation for girls.
The only sexual motivation that he gets is consuming
their flesh,
their body. And he makes that very clear. He doesn't sexually violate the girls. That's like a sticking point for him. I don't understand why. I mean, delusions, whatever. But he does treat them very differently. However, he still tries to go for children under the age of 6, preferably boys, but does make some exceptions for a few girls.
During this time, Albert recalls that he felt that God was commanding him to torture and sexually mutilate children. So we're in like full-blown psychosis here.
The voices and hallucinations and stuff that he's experiencing,
he's hearing it,
is God coming straight to him saying,
this is what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, who needs the Metatron? That's fine.
Well, only a few days later, after the Beatrice Keel episode, on July 14th of 1924, a 9-year-old Francis McDonald was reported missing by his parents. Now, a search ends up being organized, and they did find his body. He was hanging by a tree near his home, and he had been sexually assaulted and then had been strangled using his suspenders. That is unfortunately not the worst part of what happened to him. He had also suffered extensive lacerations to his legs and his abdomen, and his left hamstring had been stripped of its flesh. Albert refuses that he had any responsibility for this, but later on, he states to his lawyer that he had intended to castrate the boy, but had left him when he heard someone approaching the area. So obviously he did have something to do with this, or he wouldn't have said he had intended to castrate him.
About the castrations, these voices that he's hearing, that he's saying is God ordering him to torment and castrate little boys. He says he had visions of Christ and his angels. He began to be engrossed in religious speculations about purging himself of sins, atonement by physical suffering and self-torture, and human sacrifices. He would go on endlessly with quotations from the Bible that were all mixed up with his own sentences. So he is paraphrasing from the Bible and then kind of making up his own shit. Here's one. Happy is he that taketh thy little ones and dasheth their head against the stones. That's not a thing. No.
On February 11th, 1927, 3-year-old Billy Beaton and his 12-year-old brother were playing in their apartment hallway in Brooklyn with their friend 4-year-old Bill Gaffney. The 12-year-old leaves to go back to his apartment, but both the boys disappeared. Beaton was later found on the roof of the apartment building, and when he was asked what happened to Billy Gaffney, Beaton said the boogeyman took him.
Which makes sense because he was only 4 years old.
Peter Kuznowski was the suspect in the boys' murder, but a motorman on the Brooklyn trolley, Joseph Meehan, saw a picture of Albert in a newspaper and identified him as the old man who he saw with a little boy on February 11th. And he said that an old man had been trying to quiet a little boy sitting with him on the trolley. The boy was not wearing a jacket and was crying for his mom, and the old man had dragged the little boy off the trolley. Beaton's description of the boogeyman matched Albert's description. detectives from the Manhattan Missing Persons Bureau were able to establish that Albert was employed as a house painter by a Brooklyn real estate company during February of 1927, and on that day had been working at a location that was just a couple miles away from where the boy was abducted. So that fits in with his MO of taking advantage of little boys that are near where he is working.
Dr. Wertham, the German-American psychiatrist that had worked at length with Albert, he had Albert go over this experience with him, and he was shocked and amazed at the way that Fish would go on to describe the horrible acts of cannibalism that he committed on Billy Gaffney's body. This is the doctor's own words. His state of mind while he described these things in minute detail was a peculiar mixture. He spoke in a matter-of-fact way, like a housewife describing her favorite methods of cooking, but at times his voice and facial expression indicated a kind of satisfaction and ecstatic thrill. I said to myself, however you define the medical and legal borders of sanity, this certainly is beyond that border.
Albert ended up writing a letter to his attorney regarding this murder, and I have the whole thing in front of me. It is horrific.
We don't need the serial killer's cookbook, if that's what it is. Is it?
He talks about how he killed him. It's horrifying, to say the least.
I don't mind sharing some details. I just don't want to go into detail about how he cooked the child. Please.
It's so horrible. It's long. Like, it's fucking long.
Is that the one that his attorney was like, I'm never going to release this to the public?
No.
Okay.
No. That makes it even fucking worse that this was released, but the other stuff wasn't. He basically talks about how he tortured the little boy with a cat of nine tails, whipped him until the blood ran from his legs, cut off his ears, nose, and slit his mouth from ear to ear, gouged out his eyes, and by then he was dead.
Ugh.
That's not even the worst part of it, which I won't go into, but he does talk about how he dismembers and cooks the boy's body.
How the fuck does someone exist like this? How the fuck do our brains allow us to do this to other people? How? And let alone a fucking child. Like, when I hear this shit, I'm like, ooh, God.
I mean, and I'm paraphrasing what he said, and if you want to go searching for it, you can find it. It's not hard to find on the internet, but be wary. He's literally talking like he's making a pot roast.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I didn't want to read the serial killer's cookbook.
No, it's fucking disgusting. Shortly before his abduction that actually gets him caught, he attempted to test his, what he called, implements of hell on a child that he had been molesting called Cyril Quinn. And Quinn and his friend were actually playing outside when Albert asked them if they had eaten lunch. The boy said no, and he invited them over to his apartment. While he was cooking, the boys were wrestling around on Albert's bed, and they dislodged his mattress, and they found his knife, a small handsaw, and a meat cleaver, and they ran away.
They got the fuck out of there, and thank goodness. Fish never went back to the same neighborhood. While we talk about him being opportunistic and being impulsive, that doesn't mean that he wasn't strategic. So he never went back to the same neighborhood. He lived in at least 23 states and claims to have killed at least one child in every state where he lived. Sometime, he claims, he actually lost his job as a painter because he was suspiciously connected to these dead or mutilated children.
Right.
And he would just flee the state because obviously we know police departments could not and did not communicate with each other, let alone cross state borders.
No.
He was apprehended several times throughout his, I mean, how long did he do this? 50 fucking years? 40 fucking years? The most of his entire life?
Yeah.
And was never nailed down for anything until the very end.
Yeah. On May 25th, 1928, he was browsing the classified section of the New York World paper. And there was a young man who was 18 and wanted to find a position in the country. His name was Edward Budd, and his address was listed. On May 28th, Albert went to meet the Budd family in Manhattan, was basically giving the pretense of wanting to hire Edward. He gave them a fake name and introduced himself as Frank Howard and said that he was a farmer in Farmingdale, New York. His plan was to take Edward back with him, mutilate him, then probably eventually cannibalize him. He promised to hire Edward and his friend Willie and said that he would send for them in a few days. However, Albert failed to come and get the boys, ended up sending them a telegraph saying that he would be there at a later date. Well, he did end up going back a few days later, but when he went back, he ended up meeting Edward's little sister, Grace Bell, who was 10 at the time. And he decided that he was going to change victims and take Grace instead of Edward. He made up a whole story about having to attend his niece's birthday party and invited Grace to join him. Her parents were like, sure, you can go.
Well, I guess the mom was a little uneasy about it, but the dad was like, hey, she doesn't ever get to go out, like, let her go. And he promised to bring her back by 9 o'clock.
Well, he never comes back with her.
Yeah, he never comes back with her. I'm shocked that he would even consider going after the brother anyways, because the brother was 18 looking for farm work. Like, he's an old man.
Police actually end up arresting a 66-year-old superintendent named Charles Edward Pope on September 5th of 1930 as a suspect in Grace's disappearance. Pope's ex-wife had accused him of taking her. He ended up spending 108 days in jail. He was found not guilty during his trial. It's amazing to me that he would have even been arrested when the family knew a quote-unquote Frank Howard took her. That to me is baffling.
On June 7th, New York police mailed out 1,000 flyers. These went to police stations throughout the entire country. It even went as far as Canada, and it had a picture of Gracie with an actual physical description of what they were calling Mr. Howard. I'm making air quotations, Mr. Howard.
Right.
This actually garnered a lot of publicity because there's these flyers everywhere. And what I suspect is the reason why we know so much about Albert and about this whole situation is because this was a high-profile case.
Yes, it was. In May of 1930, Albert was arrested for doing something that he actually did pretty frequently. He would send obscene letters to women who answered advertisements that he placed in the classifieds. So he would advertise looking for a maid, and women would respond to him with letters, and then he would send them these obscene, disgusting letters back to them. This is the first time he was actually arrested for it. But following that arrest, and then another one in 1931, he was sent to the Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital for observation. And during this observation, the psychiatrist rendered him as sane and released him, which how they rendered him sane during this, I do not know.
There were several clues about Grace's disappearance. They actually found the Western Union office in Manhattan from which the Frank Howard sent his original message to the Budds, because he sends this letter to them after he kills Grace.
I was getting to that. Yeah.
Okay. And they compare it to the letter that he writes about being interested in the boys for work. They have the original message that was sent by a Frank Howard, and then they have the letter that was sent by the killer about killing Grace.
Right.
And they are able to look at the handwriting and see that they're identical. So now they know for sure Frank Howard 100% is serial killer that has taken Grace.
Doubling back on that, November 1934, an anonymous letter was sent to Grace's parents which is what starts the police off on this goose hunt of comparing letters. Mrs. Budd was illiterate and couldn't read the letter herself, so she had her son read it, which, oh my God, her poor boy reading this.
Seriously.
The letter is gruesome. You can also find it online, but it starts out, "My dear Mrs. Budd," and he talks in this letter about a Captain John Davis who had been in the military and had gone to Hong Kong, China, and he talks about how in China there was a famine for meat and that children were often killed and sold to butchers to be cut up and used as meat by the Chinese. He then goes on to talk about how his friend John had stayed there so long that he had acquired a taste for human flesh and had convinced Albert himself to try it. And that is what led Albert to kidnapping Grace. And then he goes on to give details on the visit that he had had with Grace's parents and with their son Edward. And he said that Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her. On the pretense of taking her to a party, you said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. And then he goes into great detail about how he tricks her into coming into the house, how he had stripped off his clothes, and how he murders her. But at the end of the letter, so he goes on to make it evidently clear that he had no interest in sexually assaulting this little girl, but he did eat her. And he actually tells in the letter that it had taken him 9 days to eat her entire body. The police couldn't verify who this Captain John Davis was and think that maybe this part was
just made up.
But the rest of Albert's story was accurate in the details to the kidnapping, but they could never confirm if Albert had actually eaten her body. And another thing that tipped them off was the envelope had the emblem of the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association on it.
Mm-hmm.
And a janitor that worked at the company told police that he had taken some of the stationery home and had left it at his rooming house at 200 East 52nd Street, but he had moved out. Well, the landlady at that rooming house said that Albert had been in that room but had checked out of the room a few days earlier.
But he was still waiting for a paycheck.
Yes, he was waiting for a paycheck. So William F. King was the chief investigator on that case, and he went and waited for Albert to get back to collect that check and asked him if he would come down for some questioning.
He had to wait 3 weeks, though. They had essentially given up. They were on a 24-hour surveillance for 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. Nothing happened. They gave up, and literally once they packed their stuff up and went on their merry way was when they got a phone call from the landlady
saying that he was there.
And so within minutes, the sheriff was actually able to get to the location and say that they wanted to take him down for questioning.
And Albert agreed to going for questioning, but he ended up brandishing a razor blade at King, and King was able to disarm him and take him to the police headquarters. Once he's there, Albert made literally no attempt at denying that he had murdered Grace. He even said that he had gone to the Budds' house to kill Edward. Like, he just straight is like, you got me.
Whenever we're talking about intelligence, I don't necessarily think he was the most clever man.
No.
I think that he believed, oh shit, I've been caught. I might as well just tell everything. And great news for law enforcement and for the victims' families.
Albert actually said that it had never even entered his head to rape the girl. He later claimed to his attorney that while kneeling on Grace's chest and strangling her, he did have 2 involuntary ejaculations. And his lawyer used that information during his trial to claim that the kidnapping was sexually motivated so he could avoid mention of cannibalism.
There was a whole debate during this whole thing about whether or not he was clinically insane. And it was actually the opinion of the psychiatrist and some other psychiatrists
that he was insane.
That he was insane. But ultimately, the courts did not find him to be legally insane. They found him to be functioning.
Well, it was interesting because the jury actually said that there was no doubt that Fish was insane. But ultimately, they felt he should be executed anyway because his crimes were so horrific. And so they said that they found him to be sane and guilty so that the judge would order the death sentence.
Which is not how the justice system is supposed to work.
No.
But it be like that sometimes.
It do be like that sometimes. His trial began on March 11th, 1935, and it lasted for 10 days. He did plead insanity, which we talked about, and claimed to have heard voices from God telling him to kill children. He was interviewed by several psychiatrists who testified about Fish's sexual fetishes, which included a whole fucking grocery list of issues, including sadism, masochism, flagellation, exhibitionism, voyeurism, piquerism, cannibalism, coprophagia, urophilia, hematologynia, pedophilia, necrophilia, and infibulation.
So Dr. Wertham is the psychiatrist that he mostly worked with. We've mentioned him a few times.
Yes.
Here's some stuff that Fish told the doctor. One glowing example of his religious mania is this quote: "What I did must have been right, or an angel would have stopped me, just as an angel stopped Abraham in the Bible from sacrificing his son." So he's saying, well, yeah, this was all okay because otherwise there would have been divine intervention. Obviously, Dr. Wertham believed vehemently that Fish was legally insane. He is quoted as saying, "I characterize his personality as introverted and extremely infantilistic. I outlined his abnormal mental makeup and his mental disease, which I diagnosed as a paranoid psychosis because Fish suffered from delusions, and particularly was so mixed up about the questions of punishment, sin, atonement, religion, torture, self-punishment, that he had a perverted and distorted, if you want, an insane knowledge of right and wrong. His test was that if it had been wrong, he would have been stopped, as Abraham was stopped by an angel." That is a very long way of saying, like, look, dude, this guy's really fucked up.
Yeah. Wertham actually believed that Fish had probably killed up to 15 children and mutilated about 100 others. And that figure was verified many times to me by police officials in later years. And there are some suspected victims listed, which is an Emma Richardson, age 5, Yetta Abromowitz, which was age 12, Robin Jane Liu, age 6, Mary Ellen O'Connor, age 16, and Benjamin Collins, age 17. Those are all suspected victims, but they couldn't prove it. They could only prove Francis X. McDonnell, Bill Gaffney, and Grace Budd.
So Dr. Frederick Wertham would go on to write his book called The Show of Violence, and he describes first meeting Albert in his jail cell, and he says he was shocked at how meek, gentle, benevolent, and polite Fish was. If you wanted someone to entrust your children to, he would have been one that you would choose. And I think that is very telling because obviously this man was able to convince an entire family to let them walk off with their child that they had just met.
When Dr. Wertham asked if Fish was insane, Fish answered, "Not exactly. I could never understand myself."
He even said, "I have no particular desire to live. I have no particular desire to be killed. It is a matter of indifference to me. I do not think I am altogether right." Whether that is him being self-aware or saying what he thinks the doctors want to hear, who knows? In January of 1936, shortly before he was to be executed, he was actually permitted to write a series of notes on his crimes that he was instructed to then hand over to journalists working on his particular case. But his lawyer took one look at those notes and was like, "No,
Nope.
Never turning these over."
He's quoted as saying, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read."
Now, I don't know if he means like it was absolutely disgusting, horrible, and bullshit, or if it was all true
and was so horrifying. I mean, the 2 letters that you can find on the internet are horrible. Like, I was reading them and feeling sick to my stomach.
Oh, the entire time researching this stuff because we know that he's real. I think I watched the movie that was made about him
in 2007.
I think it was called The Gray Man. I think I've seen it. To know that this was a real human being that really existed in the time of my great grandmother and yeah. So I did a little bit of digging about cannibalism because, I mean, what the fuck makes a person turn to cannibalism? I know there are tribal civilizations where it is actually considered an honorary practice where, you know, it's either what you do, you devour your enemy. It's a form of conquering, blah, 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 blah. Or it's how to release an evil spirit from a body.
Well, and then you have the cases of Dahmer, where Dahmer so desperately didn't want his quote-unquote lovers to leave him that he would cannibalize them as a way to keep them with him.
So in doing my research, I stumbled upon an article from Psychology Today. It was written by Deborah Sherman Coughlin, a PhD for Psychology Today. And she's quoted as saying, most cannibals are extreme loners. They do not have friends and they are bitter about it. Killing and eating a victim ensures that the offender is never alone, which Josie just said. He has the victims with him at all times. They can never leave. This helps the cannibal retain a sense of control over his life. To himself, he has demonstrated mastery over another human being. The victim is now part of him as a trophy. This is intoxicating and drives him to do it again.
See, now, I don't know if that applies to Albert.
I mean...
It's his motivations are so wrapped up in psychosis and so baffling to me. I truly believe that he believed God was actually telling him to do these things.
Cannibalism is not listed in the DSM, which, according to this, is the Bible of Psychiatric Ailments.
Oh, it is. That is the diagnostic standard.
Oh, okay. But psychologists have speculated that it may relate to childhood trauma relating to separation anxiety from the mother and resulting in oral aggression. That sounds like some very Freudian
bullshit there.
Yes. Many criminals who commit acts of cannibalism are actually found to suffer from schizophrenia.
You don't say.
And we have found many, Richard Trenton Chase, serial killers who had schizophrenia.
To cannibalize their victims?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. What I did find, because I had heard many, many years ago that there are some physical problems with eating human meat, just in general.
Yes.
And what I found during research for this was the brain does present an added risk since it's a part of the body with the highest concentration of prions, which give rise to the fatal disease Kuru. Kuru is like mad cow disease, but for humans. So, you know how I was talking about those tribes earlier? Many tribes that practice the ritualistic cannibalism began dying at a fast rate from a disease called Kuru, which affects the brain and the nervous system. Consuming animal or human flesh that contains an infected protein or prion causes brain deterioration, loss of motor control, and eventually death. I have always heard that if you eat the human brain, it kind of shuts your whole body down. So even if you don't die from a prion disease, mass consumption of human anatomy doesn't appear to be very good for the body. There was an autopsy done on this French cannibal, and they found out that his body was filled with pus, ulcers, and a normally large stomach, liver, and gallbladder. So eating human beings is not good
for you. Don't do it.
Do it. That's all that I found about cannibalism. I know my understanding of why it's not listed as a psychiatric ailment is because of the religious and ritualistic things that are practiced by other tribes of people. But
I know.
I don't agree with that. I feel like it still can be I think these two things can live in the same world.
I think that cannibalism as a psychiatric disorder can also live next to cannibalism as a religious practice. These two things are not the same, but...
Dahmer scale.
Oh, he's a solid 10 out of 10 for me.
This motherfucker is a 10 out of fucking 10. And I feel like we should change the name of the Dahmer scale to call it the fucking fish scale because holy shit. What the fuck?
I hadn't heard of this guy. Dahmer was like the one cannibal that I had heard of. And I was horrified by Dahmer. And I think this guy has blown Dahmer right out of the water.
Yeah.
And I feel like when we eventually get to Dahmer, we're going to be drawing a lot of parallels here.
Yeah, I concur. I do agree with you there. Normally, we'd do a palate cleanser.
I don't feel like looking at serial killer memes anymore.
Yeah.
I'm kind of at my limit of killing today.
Yeah, I'm significantly tapped out here.
So your palate cleanser is about to be some bloopers. And enjoy our fuckery because we fucked this up 3 times and now I feel extra traumatized.
Yes. That was a whole lot of having to talk about eating kids. Way more than I initially bargained for. I know this was highly requested, but I don't want to do another one.
Why was this highly requested? Why did y'all do this to us? I'm so confused. Why did you want to know more about this horrible human being?
Like,
I love our listeners, but why?
Future reference, this is my line in the sand.
You can find us on all of our social media accounts, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, at The Killer T. We are on TikTok.
Still haven't posted a video.
Still haven't posted a video though yet. But
like, what are we, like 2 months in now?
Yeah, but we have ideas. We have ideas coming to you soon-ish.
You can follow us on TikTok at The Killer T Pod.
Want to send us an email or an Instagram direct message, feel free to. Our email is thekillert@gmail.com. And if you listen on iTunes, and you want to leave us a review, we've been getting a lot of great messages lately, and we love hearing your feedback. You have no idea. When we get a message from our listeners, it makes our day.
Get so stoked.
We get so stoked.
All right, y'all. Until next time.
Bye.
Join us in the next episode where we discuss Andre Chikatilo,
the Red Ripper.
Biscuit Queen.
You're listening to Snack Time with Christina and Chelsea. We've fucked up recording the podcast 3 times now. So,
we're eating snacks.
We're taking a break and eating. This is ASMR, right? Do you think we could make an OnlyFans of just potato eating sounds?
I'm so fusty right now.
Are you grumpy? Do you need a nap?
Right now. God damn it!
Stop saying so fucking much. And actually, and also.